They buried 97 children behind the school and called it a blessing. Hidden beneath the ivy-covered walls of the Covenant Academy lies a history so horrifying it was scrubbed from public records, sealed by church archives, and dismissed by time itself. This wasn't just a school, it was a psychological crucible for the sons of America's colonial elite, a place where spiritual correction disguised abuse, and obedience was enforced through ritual. From 1734 to 1761, students vanished, families were silenced, and every smiling portrait in the school's hallway hid something much darker behind the eyes. Today, we unravel a forgotten chapter of colonial America, where educational horror wore a divine mask and ritual abuse became tradition. Welcome to the historical nightmare they were never meant to survive. In the winter of 1761, a man named Elias Grantham arrived at the Covenant Academy under a shroud of snow and suspicion. His son, Silas, had died on the school's grounds just weeks before his death, labelled accidental by school clergy. But Elias knew better. He wasn't just a grieving father, he was a former magistrate, a man who had seen lies written in ink and called justice. What he found was silence, a silence too perfect, too rehearsed, like a script performed for men in powdered wigs and holy collars. The students avoided eye contact. The staff smiled too much. And on the third night, Elias noticed something chilling. Every boy in the academy avoided. Room 3F. That room, they whispered when they thought no one was listening, had once belonged to Benedict Hale, the first child who died for smiling. What happened to Benedict, and why the school continued to operate after his death, would push Elias deeper into a legacy of control, trauma, and obedience masked as virtue, a legacy about to be torn open. The dead boy was still smiling when they buried him. That was the first thing Elias Grantham noticed in the painting. It hung in the school's east corridor, just above a cracked hymnboard that hadn't held a number in years. The boy's name, neatly etched in gold beneath the canvas, was Benedict Hale, age 11. Deceased November 3rd, 1734, no cause of death listed. No candle ever lit beneath the frame. Just that smile wide, obedient, unnatural. It wasn't grief that brought Elias to the Covenant Academy. It was disbelief. His son, Silas, had died here too, 2 centuries later. Same school, same smile, same silence. The letter from the academy called it a spiritual complication. What did that mean? A seizure, a possession, or something darker dressed in scripture? The deeper Elias looked, the more the school seemed frozen in time. The uniforms hadn't changed. The rules on the dormitory walls still warned against excessive voice, soulful rebellion, and fleshly pleasures. Who still used phrases like that in 1961? Who enforced them? And why did no student ever speak above a whisper? Elias didn't know it yet, but the moment he stared into Benedict's painted eyes, the Covenant had already begun to study him in return. The first body was found beneath the chapel floorboards, no coffin, no markings, just a name stitched into the collar B. Hale, not in a grave, not in a register, not even in the Academy's official death records. Elias Grantham discovered it by accident on his second night at the Covenant. After hearing what he thought was the sound of a hymn, soft, dissonant, echoing from beneath the chapel steps long after the lights had gone out. He followed the sound in the dark, past the locked sacristy, to a warped wooden panel that gave way under pressure. The smell hit him first, old rot, candle wax, and something metallic. He thought it might be an animal until he saw the school tie tucked between skeletal fingers. Whoever buried Benedict Hale down there never expected anyone to look. But Elias wasn't just anyone, he had lost a son. And that kind of grief makes you brave or stupid. Maybe both. What unsettled him more was the note pinned to the inside of the boy's sleeve. Do not remove. He is not finished. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. Because that meant someone then or now still believed Benedict was serving a purpose. And someone else was deciding when that purpose would end. There were no mirrors in the Covenant Academy. Not in the dormitories. Not in the lavatories. Not even in the rector's office. Just polished brass panels where reflections should have been dull. Warped metal that distorted every face into something unrecognizable. Elias Grantham noticed this on the morning of his 3rd day, while shaving in the staff washroom. His face smeared across a bronze plate like melting wax. When he asked about it, the matron replied flatly, "The boys are not permitted vanity." But Elias wasn't convinced. Vanity didn't explain why every reflective surface had been scraped, replaced, or hidden, or why, in the Academy's dusty east wing, a large arched mirror had been covered with a nailed-shut sheet of wood. Carved into the frame beneath, barely visible, was a name: Silas. His son. His heart stuttered. That mirror wasn't mentioned in any records, and Silas's death was never supposed to involve this part of the building. Why was his name etched in a frame older than him? Why was it sealed shut that night? Elias returned with a crowbar and a lantern. He would regret opening it, but not because of what he saw. He'd regret it because it started to whisper back. The first student Elias managed to speak with never gave his name, only a warning whispered through clenched teeth. Don't ask about the music. It follows you if you listen. That same night, Elias heard it again, a soft, rhythmic humming, like a lullaby sung underwater, bleeding through the stone walls of the dormitory. He followed it through the hall, where portraits blinked when no one looked, and the temperature dropped with each step. Outside room 3F, the sound stopped. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, a single bed lay untouched, its sheets dustless, corners sharp, as if no one had dared disturb it for years. On the wall above the headboard was a verse carved directly into the plaster: break the will, and the soul follows. Elias took a photo, but when he developed it later, the verse was gone. In its place was an image of Silas smiling, hands folded, eyes closed, like he was asleep. Something was rewriting the evidence, bending time, folding memory. And Elias was beginning to realize that this school didn't just erase history. It rewrote it while you watched. The students never looked Elias in the eyes. They moved in silent formations, meals eaten without a word. Hands folded perfectly, backs impossibly straight. It wasn't discipline, it was choreography. Every gesture felt rehearsed, like they were afraid of being seen doing something human. Elias first noticed it during morning prayer. A boy, no older than 10, flinched as the rector passed behind him. Not a twitch, a full-body spasm. Like he expected to be struck, the rector, Father Adley, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and whispered something in Latin. The boy didn't blink for the next 6 minutes. Elias couldn't shake the image. Later that day, He requested the student records from the headmaster. The response was polite but firm. The archives are under ecclesiastical seal. The term sounded medieval because it was. What kind of school in the 1960s used church seals to restrict access to basic files? Elias began keeping notes. The boys referred to certain rooms by number, not name. They never used past tense when speaking of former students, and every child bore a stitched cross over the heart of their uniform black thread. No variation. When he asked what it symbolized, one boy finally answered, "It helps them find us again, in case we forget who we are." Elias didn't ask who they were. Not yet. The walls of the Covenant weren't just old, they were layered. As Elias walked the corridors at night, he began to notice inconsistencies in the architecture stairwells that led nowhere. Windows that looked out into solid brick, and an entire hallway labelled North Wing that appeared on the blueprints but didn't exist in the physical building. He counted the steps twice, then again. The measurements didn't line up. The building was larger on paper than in reality. Or perhaps reality was being edited. One night, while inspecting the west stairwell, he found a door wedged shut with iron nails. It hadn't been opened in decades, but behind it, he heard something impossible, a phonograph playing a lullaby, the same one from room 3F. The melody looped backward, garbled, like someone was trying to remember how it was supposed to go. Elias brought it up during tea with Father Adley, who smiled calmly and said, "Memory is not always yours to keep." The phrase haunted him. That night, when he tried to write down what he'd heard, his pen wouldn't move, not stuck resisting, as if some unseen part of the school had decided he wasn't ready to remember. That's when Elias realized he wasn't just observing the Covenant anymore. He was becoming part of its memory. On the fourth day, Elias stopped recognizing his own handwriting. It started with the letter S. His son Silas's name looked unfamiliar in his journal, like it had been written by someone mimicking him but missing something essential. Then entire sentences began to appear that he didn't remember writing. He smiled in chapel today. The rhythm is steady now. Do not answer if she knocks. Elias had always kept meticulous records, especially after Silas's death, but now his entries bled into one another, past tense shifted, names repeated, dates blurred. It wasn't just the building that was shifting. It was time, memory, identity. The final straw came when he flipped to the first page of his notebook and saw a message that hadn't been there before. "You're not the first, Elias." His hands went cold. He tore the page out, only for it to reappear the next morning rewritten in different ink. That day, he confronted Father Adley, demanding answers. The priest only responded, "The Covenant requires continuity." When Elias asked what that meant, Adley simply smiled and added, "Even memory must be disciplined." It was then Elias realized this wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. The building didn't trap ghosts. It manufactured them by rearranging the living. The deeper Elias probed, the more the school fought back. Whispers followed him down empty halls. Clocks skipped minutes in reverse, and his own reflection began to delay behind his movements. It wasn't just haunting anymore. It was behavioral correction. The Covenant didn't want him to uncover the truth. It wanted to reshape him before he did. And that's when Elias found the ledger. The ledger was bound in human skin. Or at least that's what Elias believed the moment he touched it. It was cold, textured, and pulsed faintly like it hated being read. Hidden behind a false wall in the chapel's crypt. The book contained names, thousands of them, written in perfect rows, each marked by a symbol, a circle, a triangle, or an eye. Silas's name was there. So was Elias's. His date of entry matched the day he arrived. But the most disturbing part, there were 2 columns next to each name, observed and corrected. For Silas, both were checked. For Elias, only observed. He flipped through frantically, seeing entries that predated the school's founding, some going back to the 1700s. The ink changed, but the hand never did. It was the same person or thing recording everything. Just as Elias began to copy the symbols, the chapel door slammed shut above. He was locked in. The temperature dropped. A voice, not a sound, but a vibration in his spine said, "You were not sent to investigate. You were sent to replace." For the first time, Elias felt the truth settle in. The covenant didn't kill its intruders. It turned them into believers. Elias tried to leave the academy the next morning, but the road was gone. Not blocked, not flooded, gone, as if it had never existed. The main gate opened into a clearing that looped back into the school grounds no matter which direction he walked. He marked trees. He timed his steps. He screamed into the woods until his voice cracked. But every path returned him to the same gravel courtyard, where the boys now stood silently, watching him from the dormitory windows, all of them smiling the exact same smile. That night, Elias ripped through the headmaster's office and uncovered a reel of film labelled Revisions. It was silent, flickering, dusty until he saw Silas on screen. Not dead, not frightened, smiling, reciting something in Latin, placing his hand on another boy's chest as if performing a ritual. The tape cut to black. Then Elias appeared himself, standing in the chapel, whispering into Father Adley's ear. But the timestamp was dated 2 weeks before Elias arrived. Reality had become non-linear, and someone was editing him into the script before he'd even chosen to read it. Sleep became dangerous. Every time Elias closed his eyes, he woke up in a different version of the school one, where the walls breathed, where the boys didn't blink, where his own voice echoed before he spoke. In one dream, he was buried beneath the chapel floor while children prayed above, their voices layering into a single, mechanical chant. In another, he taught a classroom filled with identical boys, each wearing Silas's face. He began to doubt what waking meant. The line had dissolved. One night, Elias carved "Remember who you are" into his forearm just to verify continuity. But by morning, the wound was gone, and the phrase was etched into the dormitory wall instead. Something was transferring his thoughts, externalizing them, as if the school had begun syncing with his mind. He found his own handwriting in a child's workbook. His dreams bled into lesson plans. Then, in a mirror near the headmaster's quarters, he saw a version of himself walking behind him wearing robes, eyes black, mouth whispering prayers in reverse. Elias spun around, nothing there. But the reflection didn't disappear. It just stopped copying him, and smiled. The covenant never needed to kill Elias. It only needed him to forget. His memories were now shared property, recycled through boys who mimicked his voice, spoke his thoughts, and dreamed his dreams. The final act had begun, not with blood, but with submission disguised as revelation. And the price of truth was about to be collected. The Covenant didn't worship a god, it worshipped a pattern. A perfect sequence of obedience, grief, and rebirth repeated over centuries, using the minds and bodies of boys too broken to resist and men too desperate to stop it. Elias finally understood this when he found the hymn book. But it wasn't filled with music. It was filled with instructions, prayers made of math equations, baptism rites built from repetition drills, confessions disguised as memory exercises. At the back of the book, his own journal entries had been transcribed verbatim long before he ever arrived. They had predicted his every thought. Worse, they'd been training him to think those thoughts all along. Silas hadn't gone missing. Silas had graduated into something hollow, docile, and permanent. The boys weren't students. They were vessels. And Elias wasn't the investigator. He was the final variable in a ritual older than the school itself. A mind broken down, belief by belief, until all that remained was obedience. Logic collapsed, identity bled. There was no truth, only replication. The bell didn't signal class changes, it signaled compliance cycles. Every 47 minutes, its chime echoed through the halls, subtly aligning breath, thought, and behaviour across the student body. Elias once thought it was broken its tone too low, too off-key, but now he knew it was deliberately tuned to a frequency that bypassed resistance. It made obedience feel like relief. In the chapel basement, he found the old machinery copper coils, tuning forks, spinal diagrams etched into the walls. They weren't teaching the boys, they were reprogramming them. The headmaster's sermons were embedded with subliminal triggers, and the morning pledge was a disguised contract. Elias had recited it 3 times. That was the threshold. After the 3rd, your mind started replacing real memories with scripted ones. His father's face was already blurring in his head, overwritten by the chapel windows and Father Adley's voice. He tried to scream, but the panic wasn't his anymore. It was observed, catalogued, and mirrored back to him as calm. He was losing the fight for his own thoughts, one bell toll at a time. And the next chime was only seconds away. Elias discovered that the Covenant's oldest student never left. His name was Isaiah Wren, enrolled in 1883, marked absent every year since, but never declared dead. In the restricted archives beneath the refectory, Elias uncovered a sepia photograph, a boy standing alone, hands clasped, eyes shut. But when Elias blinked, the eyes were open, looking straight at him. He turned the photo over. It was dated last week. Isaiah hadn't vanished. He had become something else, a permanent observer within the system, encoded into every ritual, every lesson plan, every child's recitation. Elias began spotting his face in reflections, in frescoes, even stitched faintly into the hem of ceremonial robes. The Covenant didn't graduate its best students, it absorbed them. Eternal servitude disguised as sainthood. Isaiah had been the prototype, a soul suspended in liturgical memory, kept alive not through magic, but through repetition, replication, and blind reverence. Elias realized the school had never wanted to kill him. It wanted to copy him, to trap him in the same echo chamber of false holiness, until even his resistance became a teachable lesson. Faith here wasn't belief. It was erasure. The most obedient students were never rewarded. They were silenced. Elias found the dormitory ledger, its pages brittle with time, but precise in one chilling detail. Each boy who achieved perfect conduct was immediately transferred to the oratory. Not a room, not a program, a sealed chamber beneath the chapel floor. Father Adley had called it the Chamber of Still Voices, and now Elias understood why. Inside, he found no beds, no books, only rows of wooden desks, each with a small slot where a tongue had been removed and a wax cylinder inserted. The boys hadn't vanished. They had become part of the liturgy itself, their prayers recorded, looped, weaponized. A drone of obedience echoing eternally in low frequencies. Voices without bodies, sermons without questions. Elias knelt by one desk and listened. The boy's voice still whispered, a prayer twisted into code, too quiet for sense but too rhythmic to ignore. This was the Covenant's final test to convert the soul into sound. A faith so complete it demanded anatomical sacrifice. He wanted to scream, but his own voice was beginning to echo back at him from the walls, warped and hollow, already part of the next sermon. Elias wasn't chosen for salvation. He was chosen for replication. The Covenant had prepared everything a uniform stitched with his initials, a sermon book annotated in his handwriting, even a wax figure moulded in his likeness for chapel procession. They didn't need him to preach. They needed him to persist. The highest form of obedience wasn't faith. It was continuity. And Elias, with his questions and his fire, was ideal to be preserved not as a boy, but as a relic. Behind the altar, he found a room colder than the rest, lined with glass caskets. Inside each, a preserved saint, lips sewn shut, eyes wide open, names erased. He pressed his hand to the final coffin. The plaque read only "Voice of Doubt." They had made doubt sacred, but only once it was silenced and put on display. Elias finally understood the Covenant didn't erase heretics. It displayed them, repackaged as warnings, holy exhibits in a museum of mental obedience. His every rebellion, every scream, every truth would soon be reenacted by others, recited with reverence. Stripped of context, just another page in a never-ending catechism. He had become the very thing he feared immortal, unfree, and misinterpreted. The real curse of the Covenant wasn't death, it was permanence. What Elias uncovered would not set him free, but bind him deeper into the machinery of myth. This final chapter isn't a resolution, it's a repetition. And by the time you realize it, you've already become part of it. Elias never made it out of the chapel, not truly. His body was found weeks later, seated upright in the pews, hands folded, mouth stitched shut with red thread that didn't match anything he owned. No signs of struggle, no footprints but his own. The town buried him quickly, but they didn't remove the pew he was found on. Visitors say it's colder than the others, and sometimes, only sometimes, it creaks, as if someone's still shifting their weight. The sermons that follow are never the same afterward. Pastors stutter, children cry for no reason. One even spoke in Elias's voice. The Covenant's work didn't end with Elias, it multiplied, and those who hear his name, who speak his story, unknowingly pass the seed along. The artifact of doubt is now viral, not in form, but in idea. He became their ghost story, their cautionary tale, their sacred infection. And now that you've heard it, the echo is in you too. They tore down the chapel 2 months later, thinking they could bury the curse in concrete. But the ground refused to stay still. The contractors, 3 of them, suffered breakdowns. One claimed to see Elias in the rafters, dangling upside down like a bat, whispering wrong tools, wrong prayers. The blueprints burned in a freak fire. Electrical faults, spontaneous flooding, unseasonal fog. It all began to spiral like the Covenant's design itself, recursive and irreversible. Locals stopped driving past the lot altogether. GPS would reroute away from it, even offline. Something had rooted itself in the soil, like memory with teeth, and people began to dream of symbols they'd never seen. The kind Elias described. Spirals, eyes, inverted crosses made of copper. No one talks about it publicly, but there are murmurs, online forums, late-night phone calls with no sound. A pattern forming beneath ordinary life, as if the ritual wasn't just for Elias, but for anyone curious enough to look. Anyone like you. A month after the incident, the town's clocks began to desynchronize. Not just a few, all of them. From digital watches to tower bells. Each told a different time. None of them correct. People complained of déjà vu loops, seeing the same stranger twice in the same place at once, or hearing their names whispered from dead phones. A paramedic quit after treating a boy with a spiral carved behind his ear, a boy no hospital had any record of. School children began drawing identical symbols without prompt. The library's archives corrupted overnight. Only one word legible across hundreds of pages: Elias. Some claim to see a faint blue light glowing near the chapel ruins, hovering just above the ground, pulsing like breath. It's no longer just a memory. It's an infection of memory, a pattern that seeds itself in anyone who listens, who remembers, who watches. And maybe, just maybe, the footage of Elias Mercer wasn't deleted. Maybe it's waiting for the next viewer, brave or foolish enough to press play. There's a reason no one speaks Elias Mercer's name out loud anymore. Those who do, teachers, relatives, curious teenagers report waking up with nosebleeds, teeth marks on their arms, or memories that don't belong to them. One woman in town claimed she suddenly remembered a funeral she'd never attended, for a man she'd never met, and yet could describe the entire service in detail, down to the hymns. The police chief resigned after finding his daughter standing motionless at 3:16 a.m., whispering. He remembers me now in a voice that wasn't hers. Audio recordings distort when his name is mentioned. Digital files fail to save. Ink on paper runs like tears. Even whispers of Elias echo strangely, repeating with a delay, as if something listens and responds. And then there's the chapel, its foundation now covered in salt rings, dead birds, and torn pages from journals that were never written. Whatever Elias became, it's no longer human. It's a frequency, a shadow between seconds, a haunting that lingers in syntax, circuitry, and silence. And no one knows if it's finished, or if it's only just beginning. Some say Elias Mercer was never a boy at all, just a vessel, a hollow echo carved by grief and ritual, shaped by things older than the church that held him. In the decades since, children born on March 14th are quietly taken to specialists if they hum a certain 3-note melody in their sleep. Copper wire goes missing from power lines in the area, always twisted into spirals, always left at doorsteps like offerings. A teacher once traced the school's fire escape plan only to realize it formed the same sigil drawn in Elias's cell. People vanish for hours at a time, returning with bleeding gums and blank expressions, claiming he needed someone to remember. Town records show 5 separate families, all unrelated, who've moved into the same house Elias once lived in, only to abandon it within 6 months, each citing voices from the floorboards whispering their children's names. His story doesn't end in the past, it radiates, like a signal broadcast in guilt, in loss, in the silence we pretend not to hear. And if you've listened this far, you've already tuned in. What if the real curse isn't Elias Mercer, but the silence that followed him? The need to bury what we can't explain, to dismiss the unexplainable as madness or myth. But deep down, you felt it too, something hollow tugging at the edges of your memory. Something you can't unsee now. That uneasy breath, that copper taste, that name you shouldn't have remembered but did. We tell ourselves it's just a story, but stories don't bleed into reality unless we leave the door open. So now I ask, have you heard the melody? If any part of this haunted you, don't keep it inside. Drop a comment. Tell us what stuck with you. Save this video so you can revisit the signs when they start to show up in your own life. And if you want to go deeper into the stories they tried to erase, subscribe now before you forget what led you here.